Hey everyone, so today I wanted to talk about the controversial map at the JWOC long distance, get into why it was controversial, and offer my thoughts on it. So let's get started. So before we dive into this specific example, I'd like to just share some thoughts on how orienteering mapping has kind of changed in the last decade or so. So when I was first getting into orienteering mapping, it was probably 15 years ago. At that time, maps were becoming more and more detailed, and there's a quote out there somewhere from Thierry Georgiou where he acknowledges this. He says, "Maps are becoming more and more detailed. I'm preparing for this." And he questioned whether it was the right way, but it was a fact. And that kind of makes sense because it was around the time that LiDAR was becoming used more and more by orienteering mappers. LiDAR was becoming more and more ubiquitous. And LiDAR was a complete game changer for orienteering mapping. It provided you with a base map with so much detail compared to what you had before. A big part of the challenge of making orienteering maps before was figuring out how do I get this element that I can see in the terrain in the right place on the map. LiDAR, in many cases, makes that so easy. You can see that feature in the terrain in the LiDAR data, and you can just plot it straight away. So maybe people were getting very excited about this. They had this new superpower with LiDAR data. They could basically find all this detail that they could see in the terrain and easily plot it on their map. It didn't take them hours and hours and hours to go through the fieldwork of that anymore. Then I was away from orienteering mapping for a few years. And in the last 2 or 3 years, as I got back into it, I noticed quite a shift in this mindset. The focus was no longer on the more detail, the better. It was on a higher level of generalization. Orienteering maps should be more generalized. They should only contain those features which are very distinct and very clear. If you follow the Facebook group Orienteering Mappers International, this is really clear. Anything that comes up where there's even the slightest doubt of should I or shouldn't I put this on the map, someone is kind of doubting whether this should go on the map, the comments almost always roll in with a unanimous no. If there's any doubt, no, it doesn't go on the map. Only really clear things go on the map. And it's interesting because this year, at the biggest event on the calendar, the World Championships in Finland, we see this exaggerated almost. We have the mappers for WOC, Jan Weckman and Timo Juensu. I hope I pronounced that okay. They're the main mappers for WOC. And they bring this generalization to a whole new level. They are kind of renowned for it, for this mapping style. Some people love it, some people hate it. But it's interesting that at the World Champs, we're going to see this very generalized mapping approach. And at the Junior World Champs, we have this controversial map, which we're going to get into in a minute. So the WOC mappers, they're going to create very generalized maps. I was even fortunate enough to attend the World Cup in Finland last year with the same mappers. And it really hit me. Wow, that map was really generalized. I remember finishing the middle distance and saying there wasn't that much on the map at all. But anyway, long story short, nowadays, the general consensus in the orienteering mapping community seems to be higher level of generalization. So this JWOC map first came to my attention when somebody wrote in the national squad WhatsApp chat, wow, crazy map at JWOC this year or something, and a screenshot of all the pits. And shortly after that, I saw this Instagram story from Jose Manuel Galvez from Resknav Maps, where he says, Cositas como estas en un mundial ayudan con el síndrome del impostor, which basically means little things like this in a world champs help with imposter syndrome. And he's finished it off with hashtag vergüencita ajena, which means hashtag secondhand embarrassment. So he was obviously not very impressed by this map, or he was at least taken aback and saying, what's the story, guys? I thought we were all on the same page that we're trying to generalize orienteering maps more. And it's interesting that this guy, Jose, is actually on the IOF Map Commission this year. So he's not a nobody. He's a big voice in the right circles, and he was taken aback by this map. This map was also shared in another Facebook group called Orienteering Technical Training. And we had some funny comments underneath that. So we have a comment here, a complete joke map. This is JWOC, not a friggin' comedy event. Next comment, oh my, who was the mapper? And a funny response to that was LiDAR. And the final comment with a bit more substance was so many pits in one place has no value for navigation and not possible to place a control there. Simple broken ground could be more meaningful and map more readable. Was this map evaluated in advance by an IOF advisor or map controller? And that's again why I was kind of interested that this guy, Jose, is on the IOF map commission and he is surprised at this map. He's taken aback by this map. He's not very impressed by this map. And then we have a comment up the top from a runner giving us a bit more context into these areas of the terrain. So I was running today and I completely understand that looking on the map without running in this terrain looks really wrong and strange. But these are holes made by humans to search silver, like mines. And each of these holes is at least 3 meters deep and around 5 meters wide. Okay, that's useful information and that'll help us to kind of evaluate this. So let's actually just have a look at this map. We have it here open on LiveLox. So you can see it starts off maybe more what you would expect for an Italian long distance. Nice piece of map. And then we move kind of into more of what we're talking about. These areas with tons of pits everywhere. So you can see the course kind of does avoid this part down here and this part down here. And then there's more of it up here. So the leg 10 to 11, a long leg, the first half of this leg kind of crosses a big part of this area that's full of these pits. Again, I think the most common route here was to drop down to the track and run around like this, which meant that this area of pits was never entered by most of the athletes. There's a little bit more of it over here. Again, the course kind of comes around the more detailed part. Another area here, the course avoids it. And then we're into kind of bigger depressions rather than crazy pits. And here at the end is the only place the course really directly comes right through one of these very detailed areas full of pits. Maybe the saving grace here is that they're putting the controls on nulls rather than in the pits. So in theory, those nulls should stand out as high points in a kind of flat area with a lot of pits. And that's the course. So this area over here that the leg 10 to 11 crosses is kind of the big area that I saw a lot of people talking about. But you know, there are similar areas kind of dotted throughout the map. But again, we know that the course does its best to avoid these areas. It's definitely not putting controls in these areas. It's definitely not encouraging athletes to run through these areas. So we'll keep that in mind. So now it's kind of come the moment to offer some of my thoughts on this map. So I'd kind of brought this up in a friend setting, and a friend said to me, oh, well, that kind of just has to do with mapping style. Every mapper has their own style, and every mapper will map differently. And of course, that's true. But I feel that as a community, as an orienteering mapping community, we should really be in the same ballpark when it comes to generalization. The level of generalization that's expected on orienteering maps should be in some way standardized or in some way understood among orienteering mappers so that you do get a similar level of generalization regardless of who made the orienteering map. Obviously, every orienteering map will end up looking different depending on if one mapper did it or the other. Everybody does have their own styles regardless of generalization, but I feel that, to come up with some sort of standard to remove huge variations in orienteering maps, this is something that we should think about and that should be discussed. And I feel that is being discussed. And that's why I was surprised by this map. We heard earlier in the video that Terry Georgiou, he used to train specifically for very detailed maps. Maps were becoming more and more detailed, and he trained for that. So it doesn't really make sense now to have some competitions with very generalized maps, like we're going to have in the World Championships this year, and then other competitions with very detailed maps. You'd be kind of Athletes would be toing and froing between very different maps. So it might be ideal to avoid that massive variation. And then we look at some of these areas and, just because there's 100 boulders in an area or 100 pits in an area, it doesn't mean they all have to be on the map. You do ask yourself the question, let's take this area here. What is the purpose of having these pits on the map? What is the purpose of having these pits on the map? So we'll get to the question of safety in a minute. Ignore the question of safety and let's just look at this map. If we were to put a control in this area, would that be fair? Would that be desirable? I fear that if we put a control in an area like this, it's going to come down a lot more to eyesight and luck than it is your orienteering skill. We could see a course like this with 10 kilometers of running decided on some crappy control in an area like this, where some athletes stumble upon the control and others don't. So let's come back to the point of safety. Oh, maybe all these pits were drawn on the map because of safety concerns. Well, we don't want to just generalize and leave, for example, the whole slope marked with, well, let's come back to the safety argument. What's the safety argument? Maybe that, well, I don't want to generalize massively here and map the whole slope with the broken ground symbol, because if I do that, somebody might expect some slightly broken ground that they can just run across and they find themselves in this area full of pits that are dangerous. Fine, but what's the counter argument to that? I've put all the pits on the map so that an athlete can safely navigate through. Well, that doesn't make sense either because nobody's going to use these pits to navigate around them. And the whole point of safety here seems like it's been acknowledged by the planner. The planner has not brought athletes into this area. He's not putting controls near these pits because, from the sounds of things, that wouldn't be that safe. So if we have this big part of the map which isn't safe, we're not going to bring the courses directly into it, then again, what's the point of having all this detail on the map? We could just generalize with the broken ground symbol. I think if we did that, you would need a note in the bulletin explaining that areas full of these big mining pits have been generalized with the broken ground symbol. So be careful. Essentially, the message would be careful where the broken ground symbol exists. Yeah, I think you would have to specify that in the bulletin to provide some more information. Because obviously on other orienteering maps, broken ground could simply mean a little bit of slow running without any major difficulty or danger to cross. So I think that's kind of what it comes down to. The question of what is the point of putting all this detail on the map? Because we're not putting controls in this area. We're not even really asking athletes to run through it because most of the good route choices here stick to the paths. So what is the point of all this detail? So I think the big question to ask here is, what is the point of all this detail? Why is all this detail on the map? And it seems that if we were to put controls in these areas of detail, it wouldn't either not be fair or it would not be safe. So again, it doesn't seem like these areas of detail serve much purpose. And that to me would probably be the strongest argument for generalizing here. Never mind the argument of that's the direction the orienteering mapping community is moving in, more generalization. And we come back to a comment we had on Facebook which asked, was this map evaluated by an IOF advisor or map controller? So I'm not fully sure of the protocol, but I assume that if you're going to organize a big event like a World Championships or a Junior World Championships or a World Cup, that there's a lot of baggage that comes along with that. That there's a lot of people checking in on you, making sure you're doing a good job, making sure you live up to certain standards. And again, coming back to Jose Manuel, who is on the IOF Map Commission, who seemed to be surprised at this map, taken aback by this map. What is the process there? Was there somebody from the IOF looking at this map? Did somebody from the IOF review this map? Because either they didn't, or they did and they didn't provide much feedback. Because this map does seem to be a little bit against the tide in terms of current trends in orienteering mapping. And actually, I remember reading this at the time, and now I found it. This is the final bulletin for the World Cup in Finland last year. And you can see that it has a note on stones. Stone density is generalized to make the map readable for modern orienteering. So that basically means that they're mapping fewer stones than in the past. There aren't going to be as many stones on the map as you might expect. There's this generalization of the stone density to make the map readable for modern orienteering. So modern orienteering requires more generalized maps. We see this in a bulletin for a World Cup race. So anyway, I hope that was interesting. It's just an idea that came to mind to talk about this when I saw the JWOC map because it's interesting. So to show your support, you could like the video, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.